Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's story is a popular one that many of us heard while growing up in West Africa. It is called Mrs. Coin, the Mysterious Woman. This story is about betrayal, jealousy, and a supernatural revenge. So, let's jump right into it. In a quiet village, there was a kind teacher named Mrs. Albert. She worked at New Springford School and was loved by the children because of her kind heart. Mrs. Albert always wore high heels, so people called her Mrs. Coin because of the clicking sound her heels made when she walked. Mrs. Albert had a smart daughter named Ellen, who always came first in her class. But there was another teacher in the school, Mrs. Sandra, who was very jealous of Mrs. Albert and her daughter. Mrs. Sandra had a daughter named Beatrice, who also wanted to be best like Ellen. Mrs. Sandra and Beatrice secretly hated Ellen and her mother. One day, Mrs. Sandra invited Ellen to her house for extra lessons. Mrs. Albert, being kind and trusting, allowed Ellen to go. When Ellen arrived, she was happy to play with Beatrice, but deep inside, Beatrice didn't like Ellen. They started fighting over a toy and things got out of hands. Mrs. Sandra saw them fighting and used this as an excuse to punish Ellen. She locked Ellen in a dark room and tied her up. As night fell, Mrs. Albert became worried when Ellen didn't return home. She rushed to Mrs. Sandra's house to ask about her daughter, but Mrs. Sandra lied and said she hadn't seen Ellen. Mrs. Albert panicked and told Mrs. Sandra that she would go to the king to report about the disappearance. Mrs. Sandra, scared of being caught, hit Mrs. Albert with a big stick, killing her. Days turned into weeks, and no one could find Mrs. Albert or Ellen. Eventually, the villagers stopped searching, thinking they were lost forever. But Mrs. Albert's spirit, full of pain and anger, could not rest. She knew her daughter was still suffering, locked away, so she decided to come back for revenge. Soon after, strange things started happening at the school. Every night, the students would hear the sound of high heels walking through the hall, but they could not see anyone. Some girls even began to disappear. The school became dirty and haunted, even though it was cleaned every day. Fear gripped the village, and no one knew what was happening. The king, troubled by the strange events, went to the village priest for answers. What the priest revealed shocked him more than anything he had ever heard. That's not all, but let's take a quick breather. We will dive deeper into the chilling mysteries that has kept generations on edge. So, don't forget to like, leave your sweet comments, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for part 2, where we uncover more secrets about the mysteries of Mrs. Coin. For now, bye guys!